Evening, everyone, and welcome to our Fire Ecology of Oregon webinar series. Glad you could all join us this evening. Joined this evening by a number of my extension colleagues, Micah Schmidt, Jacob Putney, Carrie Berger, Chris Adlam, just lots of us here to help answer questions tonight. We are very pleased to have with us Dr. Andrew Merschel, who is a postdoc scholar at Oregon State University and associated with the Forest Service PNW Research Station. He's going to be talking to us this evening about West Cascades and Coast Range forests. I'm really eager to hear about the great work that he's done and just learn from him as we talk about these forests where we maybe don't think so much about fire, but fire is absolutely, as we're going to see, a very important component of those ecosystems. As we have done in our other series, just remember that we take questions for Andrew through the Q&A feature of Zoom. So look for the little button that says Q&A, and that's where you'll enter the questions that you would like Andrew to respond to. Please keep them very focused on the material that he's presenting on. If you have other questions that aren't directly aligned with this presentation or questions about other presentations, you can drop those into the chat and we'll record them and we'll try to find an answer for you and get that information back to you. Jake, why don't you take a minute and tell these good folks here how they can get continuing education credits?
Yeah, continuing education credits are available through the Society of American Foresters, Associated Oregon Loggers, as well as the Oregon Certified Burn Manager Program. For SAF credits, there is a form on the website. If you download that form, put your name, email, SAF number, and the keyword that I'll announce at the end of tonight's session, I get those credits recorded. You can either return one form after tonight's session, or if you want, you can wait till the end of the series and just return one form for all the sessions you attended. And then for Oregon Pro Logger credits, if you just send me an email with your name, company you're representing, I'll get those recorded. And then for CBM, if you want to send me an email as well, I can keep those recorded either after tonight's session or again at the end of the series.
Thank you, Jake. Jake does a great job managing all of that for us and making sure that any of you who need those credits get credit for it. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and let him do any other additional introduction that he needs, and then we'll just jump right into his material. Andrew, thanks again for being here.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I'm really excited to give you guys a presentation on the fire ecology of the West Cascades and Coast Range forests. I want to start out by saying that this is an emerging science in fire ecology. We're learning a lot recently, and I think there'll be a lot of exciting information to share with you tonight. So before I dive into the science and the research that's going on, I want to recognize that much of this work has been completed over the past 7 or so years since 2018. We've had lots of support from National Forest, from PNW Research Station, and from Oregon State. And then I want to thank a lot of co-investigators and collaborators, James Johnson, who will be following me next week, and then Micah Schmidt, who spoke with you guys earlier and gave a really good introduction to the methods we're using to reconstruct historical fire regimes. So our topic of interest today is these moist, super productive west side forests. They're often referred to as Douglas fir forests, but we're basically talking about forests west of the Cascades crest in the Coast Range, where Douglas fir is the keystone or primary species, and a western hemlock, western red cedar, grand fir in some sites, and Pacific silver fir are other key species. So I wanted to start out tonight just sort of touring with photos one of these super productive temperate rainforest stands to get our mind into the forest. So here I'm showing you a stand that's at about 3,900 feet on the South Santiam River. It's up above the river. The Douglas fir in the background there is about an 800-year-old tree. The cedars that you're seeing in the foreground are about 300 years old. And you're seeing a stand with a lot of the characteristic features of old growth on the west side. So large dominant Douglas fir trees, multi-storied structures, snags and logs. And here's a couple shots of a tree ring crew quarrying trees at this site to understand how it developed this old growth structure over time. One cool part about this photo that you can see is all that char on the oldest Douglas fir cohort. So both the Douglas fir in the foreground and the Douglas fir in the background. So I want to start us off with a poll tonight. I just sort of walked you through sort of characteristic old growth Douglas fir site. And I want to know what you guys estimate the frequency of fire was at this site. So our first poll, I'm going to send it out now. Let me make sure I activate this relaunch poll. Okay, so you guys should be seeing a poll now. My question for you is, how many fires occurred at this site since the year 1600? So 1 high severity fire, 2 to 3 fires, 4 to 5 fires, or more than 5. Thanks all for your participation here. Just about wrapped up. And what I'm going to do is a little later on in the presentation, we'll revisit this site and we'll see that the specific years in which this site burned. Okay, I think that's good there. I'll end the poll and share the results. It looks like the majority of people are estimating more than 5 fires. Most people have estimated at least 4 to 5 fires. So thanks for your participation there. All right, so mentioned our study focus here is the super productive west side forests. I want to point out some of the characteristic features of old growth. We often have sort of an old growth dominant Douglas fir cohort at the site. In this example, this stand has a backbone of Douglas fir that was established in the 1560s. You can also see a younger cohort of western hemlock here. You can see snags, you can see logs, and you can see canopy gaps. These are all sort of the characteristic elements of old growth. And a key question is, how do these develop over time, and how is fire related to that development? So right now I'm showing you sort of the conventional model or standard model that's a hypothesis for how old growth develops in this forest type in the Pacific Northwest. You're probably all very familiar, many of you are probably familiar with this model, but the basic hypothesis here is that you have a stand replacing fire that kills nearly all or the majority of trees. After that stand replacing fire, you get a cohort of Douglas fir that establishes, usually pretty densely, and the trees in that cohort start to compete with each other over time. And a process called self-thinning happens. As those trees sort of compete for resources, the ones with less drop out of the stand, and you start to get into a mature phase. In the mature phase, stand dynamics shift to insects and disease, picking off individual mature Douglas fir. And what that process does in theory is it creates canopy gaps that allow the reinitiation of understory during the mature forest phase. And so hemlock, western red cedar, grand fir would come into those canopy gaps. And over time, that process of within stand mortality, canopy gap creation, and establishment of shade tolerance develops this multi-layered sort of classic old growth stand at 400 or 500 years old, where we've got our snags, our logs, gaps, openings, and multi-stories. So what I want to point out about this is this sort of dominant or conventional model for the west side pretty much assumes that the development of old growth structural features is really just a function of succession over time without fire playing a major role. And I think a lot of the reason the thinking went that way in the west side is because the west side does have extensive high severity fires as part of its disturbance regime. So of course, we recently saw these in the 2020 fires, and we have good records of them happening historically. So the Cult fires, of huge high severity fire event in 1902. We also saw the repeated Tillamook burns beginning in 1933. And then we have good records of extensive high severity fires in 1849 and 1868 in the Coast Range. So we know when we get dry east winds at the end of a long, hot, dry summer, we get these big patches of stand replacing fire. They don't happen frequently, and this sort of made everybody focus on that element of fire in these ecosystems. But there's Some other clues that the disturbance history or fire history might be much more complex on the west side. And the first one I want to talk to you about are the fire adaptations or fire resistance of Douglas fir to fire. So this is the keystone species, the dominant one in this system. It is very tolerant to moderate severity fire or relatively high intensity fire. And what I'm showing you here in this picture are some of those features. So as a mature tree, it develops very deep insulating bark that's going to allow it to survive as a fire passes. It's a self-limbing tree, so that means it's going to move its branches away from the ground, away from where fire could go up into the crown. And then in the center, I have sort of the bread and butter of tree ring reconstruction work, a Douglas fir here that's showing 3 very clear fire scars. So these are times when a fire burned through this stand. It did not kill the tree, killed a portion of the tree bole, and then the tree grew around that wound. So Douglas fir in its adaptations to fire is really trying to tell us that maybe fire is not all that infrequent on the west side. So just showing you a paper by Stevens et al. From 2020. What he did is he looked at the fire resistance scores or traits of different conifers in the western US, and then he mapped that in this figure here. And then he compared that to what we have as sort of our published or accepted fire regimes in the western US. And so this color right here, resistant infrequent, you can see it's mapped broadly across the west side of the Pacific Northwest. And what he's showing you there is there's a mismatch between the fire resistance traits of these forests and how we've classified the regime. So we've classified it as infrequent, but really the tree species are telling us that it's probably not infrequent over much of the area. There have been advances that really shape the work we're currently doing today, and I really like to share this example from Alan Tepley's work. Alan looked at different researchers going back to the early 1900s who were sort of arguing actually fire probably plays a pretty active role on the west side. And what he did to look at that question is he cored, I think, 140 different stands on the Willamette National Forest, and he looked at how they developed over time. And so what you're seeing on this graph is different development history models based on those tree coring efforts. And he found that about 2/3 of everything he sampled fit in with a moderate frequency fire regime where low to moderate severity fires were creating tree cohorts and sort of modifying or mediating stand development over time. He also found sort of evidence that the traditional model, infrequent stand replacing fire, was part of the system. And then also even frequent low severity fire was part of that system. The limitation in this work is that we didn't yet have fire records from fire scars. And that's what we've been moving to over the past seven years or so. So when we started doing new fire reconstructions on the west side, this was the map that was sort of the latest version of what fire regimes were historically in the west side. So a map of the Northwest Forest Plan area here, divided into different fire regime types. You can see a lot of the area is hypothetically predicted to be in that infrequent stand replacement high severity fire regime, quite a bit in the moderately frequent mixed severity fire regime. And then you have to go all the way down south to find frequent mixed severity or very frequent. What I like to point out about this map from 2018 is this isn't actually a map of historical fire regimes that is based on empirical data of historical fires. What this really is it's a crosswalk between temperature, precipitation, and lightning zones in the Pacific Northwest, two existing land fire types. So this is a best hypothesis at the time saying, we know that temp and precip matter for fire. We know that lightning ignitions matter for fire. So we've made groups there and we'll crosswalk them to land fire regime types. I want to point out here that mapping and that thinking is missing a few critical parts. The first being that indigenous fire stewardship was really important to culturally important plants for indigenous peoples in the Northwest and animals. And they used fire skillfully. And there's lots of records that fire was preferably used in moist forests. The second thing I like to point out is that flammability varies over time in our West Side forest with the structure and composition of vegetation in these forests, or the fuels, to put it another way. So just some research here by Agee and Huff, where they looked at stands of different ages, and then they measured the microclimate in those stands and the fuels. And they found that you have a much higher rate of spread, much higher flame lengths in younger forests on the west side, or post-disturbance forests. So we can think about why that is. If you're in a recent high severity burn on the west side, you're going to have much higher temperatures, much lower humidity, much higher wind speeds. You're also going to have a lot of relatively fine 10-hour fuels that adjust to that dryness quite quickly. You can compare that to a mature stand that has higher humidity, lower temperatures, and lots of coarse 1,000-hour fuels, and they have very different flammabilities. So one thing that's maybe missed is that these aren't always these very fire-resistant structures. Post-fire, they're actually quite flammable. So we have to think that fire activity might be dynamic over time on the west side because of how fuels change over time and microclimate changes, and then also how people have used fire on the west side. So now I'm going to sort of launch into some data from this research. And on the left, I'm showing you a map of new fire histories on the west side that have gone in it since 2017. And we're going to be jumping around this map tonight and exploring different fire histories. The ones in red are ones we have completed. The ones we have in black there on that map are in progress. We'll be going after those this summer. Micah did a fantastic job of explaining how we reconstruct fires. The photo on the right is showing several different historical fires that are recorded in the form of cambial fire scars on a Douglas fir collected on the Umpqua National Forest. So I want to say, make a point about 2 points about the west side. I'm going to do that with this graph. This y-axis here is precipitation. The x-axis is temperature, and the shading you're seeing in the background is the climate space for precip and temperature in the western U.S. And next, I'm going to show you where fire histories were done before we started this work. So what you can see represented by those triangles is the previously published fire histories. Most of these fire histories have been in relatively dry ponderosa pine forests. We're sort of pushing the frontier into much more moist, productive forests. So the triangles I just popped up here are showing you the temperature precipitation of the areas we're about to talk about here. So we're in a very moist region. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that the west side includes tremendous variability in temperature and precipitation. We know those are two important drivers of fire. So when we start off saying the west side has an infrequent high severity fire regime, we're talking about a massive area that actually has a ton of variability in how wet it is, how hot and dry it is, and then also other things like how people used fire, lightning ignitions, etc. So what I'm trying to do here by showing you this broad space of temperature and precipitation on the west side is let you know that there's likely going to be a lot of variability in fire on the west side. Every once in a while, I'll have a gray box pop up during my presentations. When I do that, it's just to highlight a key point. What you're going to see for these fire histories is new. It may be surprising. And the reason for that is this is the first time over the last 7 years that cross-dated fire histories have been put in forests that are this moist and productive. Just a few shots of how we do this work. Micah went over this with you guys earlier. We go to clear cuts or areas where old dead Douglas fir are abundant. We knock the top of these stumps off with a chainsaw, and that's how we locate and find cambial fire scars. Hard work. There's Micah there on the right. And then at the end of the day, we end up with 15 to 20 different cross sections from different trees. So all piled up, ready to take back to the lab. And you can see different fire scars on each of these samples from this site. Once we get them back to the tree ring lab, we go through a pretty labor-intensive process of surfacing and sanding them so that we can precisely date them. The machine you're seeing running there is a stroke sander, and it's greatly saved me from spending time in that shop. Okay, real quick refresher here. We always get the question, how do you know the exact year of a fire that happened when you're reconstructing that fire off a dead tree? The answer here is we use climate that is recorded in tree rings to date every single ring on every single sample to the exact year it formed. So tree ring growth or annual growth is sensitive to droughts and sensitive to wet years. You get a thin year in a drought, you get a fat year in a wet year, and this creates a barcode over time. And so we've created a barcode of this ring width variation going back about 1,000 years. And we can take dead pieces of wood, we measure their ring widths over time, and then we can use computer dating or our own knowledge of the marker years to make sure we're dating each ring to the year it formed. So once we have all the samples surfaced and processed and every ring dated, we can then identify each fire scar on each sample and assign it to the year that it happened. So just an example of a really helpful tree sampled near Loon Lake, Oregon. The tree's established in 1490, and it records 7 fires between 1541 and 1889 at a site that historically had an average of 80 inches of precipitation annually. So that's the basic methods for how we get this information about historical fires on the west side. I think I'll take a quick break for questions here if there's any questions.
Andrew, we have a question here that says, hasn't the Willamette Valley been burned historically by native peoples to maintain the oak savanna of the valley?
Excellent question. Yes, absolutely. There's a fantastic book by Robert Boyd, Indians and Fire in the Pacific Northwest, that has a lot of good information there, but several other sources. I could send out a bibliography of different sources about cultural burning if you guys like after the presentation.
So AIM asks, is it cut and dry when determining if a Doug-fir burn scar is from just the odd lightning strike for a small area, or if there's more of a forest-wide burn event?
Excellent question. So if you put in one sample point and cut fire scars at that sample point, you really know nothing about the extent of the fires you've reconstructed. So what we like to do if we want to assess fire extent is to put several different fire history points out on a grid, and then you can compare fire years between different grid points and get a sense of how big fires were over time.
Michelle asks if there are any common themes in the variability of fire severity on the west side. For instance, is it because of land use, because of elevation, water proximity?
Excellent question. We're still learning that. I'll get into some of that as we go forward.
Matthew asks if you can chat a little bit about how trees grow around that dead burned layer.
Yeah, good question. This is maybe not the best tree to give you an example on, but a tree is a cylinder, and its outermost ring of cells is called the cambium, and that's what's adding on the annual ring each year. And that cambium can be killed on part of the cylinder, but not on the rest of it. And for example, in 1751, the cambium is killed where I'm sort of moving my pointer here on the screen. But not over here. And so this part of the tree is still alive, and it wraps around and it closes up that wound. So you would have seen that wound be open for several decades until the Douglas fir grew around it.
And these last two are kind of the same. Do you have a way to tell through your fire scar dating whether the fires have been lightning started or human started?
You can't tell from a fire scar by itself. In order to tell how a fire regime is supported by cultural ignitions versus lightning ignitions, you're going to need to use several lines of evidence. I'll go into that a little bit later. You can look at lightning frequency in the area. Another big clue is how fire changes over time. So if you know something about what humans were changing and you see changes in fire as human populations change, That's a big hint. And then finally, you can look at the relationships between climate and fire. So if you see really strong fire-climate relationships, it sort of argues that climate is a big driver. But if you don't see that, it may help provide supporting evidence that it's actually people setting fire.
Great. And Pete just wants to know when you're going to answer that poll, give the poll answer.
Oh, not for a little while. It's later in the presentation.
Thanks, Andrew. We'll let you move on.
Okay, sounds good. So now I'm going to get into some research results for you. This is research from the Umpqua National Forest. This is the study I did for my dissertation work. Just had a publication come out last year. If you're interested, there are 6 different reconstruction sites here across the Umpqua National Forest, which is in the Southwest Cascades in Oregon. Today, we're going to travel to 3 of them and look at some data. We're going to go from the Black Canyon site, which is relatively hot and dry, to the Oak Flat site that has a clear history of indigenous fire stewardship. And then we're going to wrap up in the Calf site, which is at really high elevation in the Silver Fir zone. Something you need to know about the study design, each one of those study sites actually consists of several individual sample plots. So for example, the Black Canyon site consists of 9 different sample plots, and they're approximately 1 kilometer apart. So we're going to go there and we're going to look at the history of fire, but also how fire shaped forest development at that site. I'm going to start at this site right here and show you that first. So each one of these sites, we mapped off a 50 meter by 50 meter area. We then mapped the location of every tree in that area, and then we got as many tree ages as we can. There's cases where trees are too rotten to age or they don't have a center. But the figure I'm showing you right now is showing you the age structure or development history of the stand pictured on the right. And so each tree is represented by a circle. They're color coded by species, and then the year of establishment is noted. So this is a Douglas fir established in 1709. This is a grand fir established in 1852. So when you look around this figure, you can see that there's actually a couple different age classes in this stand. There's a tree right here from 1763, right next to a tree from 1707. They're not established after the same event. Tree that's much older from 1531, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ages in this little 50 by 50 meter area. So my question is, how did that become an old growth site, and how did fire influence that over time? So the other piece of data at these sites is the record of fire. This first graph I'm showing you is fires over time. So each tree that was sampled there gets its own timeline, and then these vertical tick marks on those lines indicate fires. And so that gives us a record of fires across time. This line right here, it's all connected because several trees recorded this fire. This last fire here is only recorded on 1 tree, but that's our record of fires at the site. The next thing we have is an establishment graph related to those fires. So this is the age of all the trees in that stand. Each tree gets a timeline. For example, this is a tree established in 1694, right after a fire that occurred in 1693. So these vertical lines are now representing the fires. What I want you to see here is that there's probably a high severity fire in 1693. Then there's a little window where maybe some trees started establishing, but there's a reburn in 1706. And after that reburn, there's a big cohort of Douglas fir that establishes. Another fire in 1762, another group of trees establish, or tree cohort establishes. You can see additional fires, 1781, 1823, that didn't result in tree establishment. And then sort of my favorite part of this is even the shade tolerance, your grand fir, western hemlock, etc., established after fires in 1847 and 1869. So what's really cool about these forests is it's actually fire that's non-stand replacing that is allowing tree cohorts to establish and creating that multi-layered mixed species structure. Bottom part of this graph is just a cohort detection method, but these peaks are showing you when trees came into the stand and how they were associated with fire. So I'm going to move into something a little bit more complicated across the whole study site, that's showing you how fire is related to tree establishment or these tree cohorts and how variable that was across the study site. So hold on here. There's a lot on this graph. This first top panel is showing you tree establishment over time. So this is simply the amount of trees established per decade over time. You can see big pulses of establishment right around 1700, another big pulse right around 1775, and one again in 1850. The bottom part of this graph is a little bit hard to follow, but it's now breaking that history up into the different plots at the Black Canyon site. So remember I said I had 9 plots that were all about 1 kilometer apart from each other. And on this graph, the vertical hash mark indicates that a fire happened in that year. If it's a red diamond, that indicates the fire was stand replacing. And if it has a C, that indicates the fire created a tree cohort. So going back to this slide, one of these blue peaks was detected. And what I want you to do is just look at that bottom graph and look at how what fire did over time varied at these plots. So we not only have frequent fire at this site shaping structure and composition of forests, we have mixed severity fire. So sometimes these fires aren't creating tree cohorts, sometimes they are, and sometimes they're stand replacing fires, but it's not happening the same way across the full study site. So what we have is sort of pyrodiversity in what fire is doing in these different stands over time as it shapes them. We had a question earlier about how do you understand fire extent? That was a great question. So I'm just going to go back to it and say, by having these multiple plots in the area, I'm able to tell that this 1849 event burned across all 9 of them. So it sort of burned over the whole area. Whereas, sorry, my bad. This fire right here, I'm not sure what year that was, but it was only recorded at BC 6. So a smaller fire there. So main point here, that was a lot. To put this into words, I want to tell you that at least in the Southwest Cascades, the complex habitat and old growth structure that we see in old forests is possible not because fire didn't happen and succession happened in the absence of fire, but probably because of that recurrent mixed severity fire in that part of the Douglas fir region. Much more eloquent way to put that is it's not just time since fire, it's time and fire that shapes these stands in the relatively dry parts of the Douglas fir region. I'm going to move now to the Oak Flat site and talk to you about a really convincing record of Indigenous fire stewardship. And I think this has been left out of sort of conventional Western thinking as we've thought about historical fire in our moist forests and on the west side. So that's the main point of traveling to Oak Flat here. What I have here is just a representation of fire over time and how it changed with colonization. So we have time on the x-axis, and then we have a climate index on the y-axis. Negative values on the y-axis indicate hot summers with low precipitation in the red. The blue shading here indicates cool, wet summers. The blue dots are fires. And so what I want you to do is look before this dash sign, before 1856, and you see a fire occurring at this Oak Flat site at about every 2 to 3 years before 1856. So extremely high fire frequency. We've done a lot of fire sampling east of the Cascades and never seen fire this frequent. Next thing I want to point out is that between 1800 to 1820, you have this relatively cool, wet period where we rarely find fire on the west side, but this site burns a total of 7 times in actually 9 times in that cool, wet period. So even though climate says that it should be suppressing fire, there's still a lot of fire at this site in that period. Fast forward to 1856, and that marks the tragic and forcible removal of Native Americans to reservations in the area. And it's after that period that you see a rapid decrease in fire frequency at the site. And now you only see fires in your drought years. So you no longer see them in those cool, wet summers. So great question earlier. If we want to understand how cultural burning influenced fire regimes on the west side, you need multiple lines of evidence. And there's also a lot that fiery dendrochronologists who are looking at fire scars can't tell you. So this is sort of sterile. This is just fire years on a graph, but what's lost in this story is the story of how fire was used, the why, and why it was important to those people. So lots to learn about cultural burning on the west side. We're now going to travel to the Calf Creek study area on the Umpqua. This is in that Pacific silver fir zone. So we've moved up much higher in elevation. You can see sort of this classic super productive old growth forest there, some giant hemlock, giant Douglas fir, even some western yew in this stand with that multi-layered story. My question is, again, how did this happen over time, and how did fire play a role in the development of the forest you see in the picture? I've got another gray slide up here. My main point before I walk through this example is that variation in the tempo or timing and severity of fire created diversity and successional dynamics and forest conditions at fine scales. So I'm going to walk you across the individual plots again at this site and show you how different the histories are at this Calf Creek study site. So again, there's 5 plots. They're about 1 kilometer apart. So the top graph here is showing you that tree establishment for all 5 of the study plots over time. That's color-coded by species. And the bottom graph is showing you the records of fire at this Calf Creek site. And so what happened at this site is there was a stand replacing or high severity fire that was probably quite extensive in the year 1719. And so you can see there's very little tree establishment in the record prior to that because very few trees survived that fire. And then you get a little pulse of regeneration. So the site only waited 10 years before it had a reburn after that initial high severity fire in 1729. And then you get another tree cohort establishing. Over the next 100 years, there were several reburns of that initial high severity fire at this site, and many of them were associated with new cohorts of trees until there was a final fire in 1812. So this is sort of reminiscent of what happened after the Tillamook fires or the Yakult fires, where we have a really moist west side system. There's an initial extensive high severity fire, and then there's several reburns of that event. And it's these reburns that sort of create diversity in how the new forest develops. And to make that point, look at the bottom graph. Site CC1 has 5 reburns, and it has 3 different cohorts. Site CC2 only has 2 reburns and 1 additional cohort. If you look at site CC5, I couldn't detect any fires at that site. It looks to have a totally unique development history compared to the other ones. Site CC3 burned again severely in 1812, and there's only 1 tree cohort at that site. Graphs can have way too much information on them. I apologize if this is an overload, so I thought I'd show you guys some pictures. So moving on to pictures of the forest that have these different development histories at this site. Here's one of the sites. This is one that only experienced 2 reburns, one in 1729 and one in 1752. And there's actually 2 very distinct cohorts of Douglas fir at this site corresponding to those different reburns. This site here, the one from the first picture, interestingly, it's the site with the most layering, the most complex age structure, has 5 different reburns. And so each reburn was associated with new cohorts of Douglas fir and western hemlock that came into the site. And it has what a lot of us is sort of lumped into this site didn't burn. It's true that this site hasn't burned since 1812, but from 17 to 19 to 1812, it burned 5 times. Finally, that last site burned at high severity in 1812. It has no reburns, and every tree at this site dates back to that 1812 fire. So it has a much more simple age structure at this site. So time for another poll here. Let's see. I guess, yeah, here we go. So I'm going to launch another poll. Your question to see if you're following along is, in the Umpqua National Forest, the frequency of fire and fire effects varied, and you can choose your answers. Answers are among sites, among plots within the same sites, over time, or all of the above? And you guys are passing with flying colors here. So the message here is pyrodiversity. We do not see fire doing the same thing across space or time. It's a really interesting fire regime that sort of doesn't fit our standard models of low frequency, low severity, or infrequent high. It's that mixed severity fire regime that's quite complex. All right, so I'll share the results there. Great work, everybody. Okay. So before I get into the next study, maybe take 3 to 4 minutes for questions here.
Excellent. So Alyssa asked, do you think that trees establish best in non-stand replacement fires due to lower intensity burn? It seems that the lower intensity would preserve the dormant seed bank.
So I would say that there's winners and losers here. So if you have a relatively high severity fire that's moderate to high severity, Douglas fir is going to be the dominant species establishing in that stand. If it's a really low severity fire, you're probably going to see a lot more hemlock and grand fir establishing after that fire. There's a really good paper by Chris Dunn, James Johnston that looked at modern mixed severity fires in the Coast Range and found that there's a sweet spot for fire severity where you get the greatest diversity of tree species establishing after fire. So if you push it to the high end of severity, it's going to be more shade tolerant species. The low end, it's going to be more western hemlock, grand fir. And then in the middle, you get the greatest variety of different species.
Michael asks, historically before 1860, is fire with cohorts happening more in succession of forests that have developed with fire and time? I'm not sure I'm following his question there. So before 1860, do you think that fire is happening more through succession or more because of fire?
I'm not sure I follow completely,
Yeah,
but
not either.
we can come back to it, but I think there's a lot of variability in where cultural burning is influencing the landscape and where these big east wind events are happening. So both of those things have a big influence in the frequency of fire over time. And so it's part of the mess or the mystery that's on the west side is both of those two drivers interacting.
And maybe one more quick one. Marilyn asked, do you know of any studies that are paralleling yours and looking at birds, wildlife, in having their succession as you're working through these different stands?
Yeah, so it's a sort of a new joint venture between fire ecology and wildlife ecology. But Jen Bailey, who's a PhD student, is looking at how forest development and fire histories influence marbled murrelet habitat. I'm going to give a few of her slides tonight as we go into the Coast Range. But great question there. We'll see a little bit of that going forward.
Thanks, Andrew.
Cool. So at this time, we're going to move further north in the West Cascades out onto the Willamette and Mount Hood National Forest. And the point here is just to give you a tour of some of the variety of fire histories that we've been seeing in the West Cascades. So just an example here, we're going to start near Detroit, Oregon, in an area that was burned severely in the 2020 fires. And my main point of showing you this series of different examples from the West Cascades is to say that fire regimes were tremendously diverse across the Douglas fir region. So I sort of think of these as different archetypes or groups of fire regimes that we've been seeing at different sites. So this is the fire history for this site near Detroit, Oregon. Each tree gets its own timeline. When we have fire scars on these next few graphs, they're represented by these triangles. So what happened at this site at Detroit? Probably a stand replacing fire sometime around 1635. This blue line is pointing you to a cohort of Douglas fir that established after that. There's another 2 fires right before 1700 and a cohort of Douglas fir after that. several fires that didn't result in cohorts between 1750 and 1800, and then a new cohort of trees right around 1800 following a fire. So this is sort of something that we've seen on the west side, often near relatively low elevation sites near major rivers. So if you think about the Cowlitz River, the Santiam River, Willamette River, we often find sort of this pattern of frequent west side fire in those areas. The next sort of grouping or type that I see out there happens in these moist sort of mid-elevation western hemlock sites. This is the forest I was showing you a slide of at the beginning, and this is at about 3,800 feet on the Willamette National Forest. So I mentioned all these different structural components in the stand, and here's what happened in terms of fire in this stand. So see if I have my arrows. Yeah, so there's probably a high severity fire around the year 1564 at this site. There's 3 more burns in the next 100 years, so 1615, 1621, and 1663. And then the really interesting things about these sites in this moist sort of mid-elevation zone is that fire frequency is not stable over time. It's non-stationary. What I mean is that there's variability in the frequency of fire over time. So here we had 4 fires in 100 years, and then we reached a sort of mature forest stage, and then we go close to, I think, 150 years here with no fire at this site. So it went from burning rapidly to this long period of development without fire, and then there's 2 fires in the 1800s. So the point here, historical fire intervals were non-stationary in some of our west side forests. Another way to say that, the tempo of fire varies substantially over time at many of these sites. And so what I would say here, this should have been a poll question, but is it a good idea to talk about a fire return interval at this site? And I think the answer is no. It would be pretty misleading, because you should expect both frequent fire and long periods without fire shaping the development in this zone. So we're back to our poll question here from the beginning, back to that silver fir stand. And I thought people would lowball this, but this stand had, I think, 6 fires as it developed since the year 1600. Just for reference there's a person standing in the background there. But this Douglas fir I'm pointing to is about 800 years old, and the big cedars in this stand date back to a fire in 1759. So here's the history for that site from the poll. Probably a high severity fire right around the year 1200. We had a hard time picking up any fires until 1600. We picked up 1 fire scar. Then in 1759, we picked up a fire that created sort of today what the dominant cohort is at the site. So you sort of have this super old age class dating back to around 1200, and then another age class that's really common there dating back to this fire in 1759 that was probably a moderate to high severity fire. And then in the 1800s, there were 4 fires between 1836 and 1889. So that's what produced a forest that looks like that. And you can see those 2 major cohorts in this photo. Last, I'd like to sort of wrap up this tour of variability in fire at site 92. This is at sort of the upper elevation limit for the Douglas fir in the silver fir zone. And this is the record at this site. So we have really old Douglas fir established in the late 1200s. And you'll notice very little evidence of fire playing a role at this site. So we did find 1 fire scar, but other than that, there's been several hundred years where this forest didn't develop with fire historically. So I've just walked you through a huge range, places with frequent fire to places that sort of fit the conventional model of stand replacing fire at really long intervals. So I'll take another stop there and just do some quick questions on that tour of different fire histories in the West Cascades.
We don't have any questions accumulated yet, but I'll
Okay.
ask one that I kind of often hear is, do you think in your reconstruction of fire histories that you may be missing fires that are low enough in severity that they maybe didn't leave fire scars, particularly in some of these stands that aren't showing them at all? Could there have been fires in there that just didn't leave a scar?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're underestimating historical fires at these sites for a couple reasons. Most trees aren't going to form a scar. Some trees form them much better than others, especially for Douglas fir. Our way to get around that is to sort of sample as many stumps as we can. So when we take 15 or 20 back home with us, we probably cut into about 60 and left many behind. When on the current slide here, for the amount of effort we put into this site, it's really good evidence that fire didn't happen there very often. So it is safe to say that we're missing some fires, but it's also, I think, valid to say that these are real differences among these sites. Had there been more fire here or more of a role for fire, we would have picked it up. But certainly there's low severity fires that we're likely missing at these sites. I'll keep on trucking here. Next we've got one more poll. I would want people to sort of weigh in here. Let me go back. The coast poll. Okay, so I just launched a poll. I want you guys to weigh in on how you would describe fire regimes in the Central Oregon Coast Range. A, infrequent high severity, B, moderately frequent mixed severity, or D, all of the above. This is cool. It's fun to see these roll in. Okay, I'm going to let that poll run in the background and just sort of move forward. So here, this is a shot of Zoe and I sampling fire history in the Oregon Coast Range. This is another level up in sort of difficulty in the work in the field, but it's been really interesting and really rewarding. And it's sort of how we're crossing over into studying how fire influences habitat for different wildlife species. So next, I'm going to venture with you guys into the Coast Range. I want to talk about ongoing study led by Jen Bailey. That is the role of disturbance in shaping the nesting habitat of marbled murrelet in the Western Oregon Coast Range. So the photo you're seeing here is it's actually taken from a nest stand looking out into the forest from where a marbled murrelet has made a nesting platform. So what you need to know about the marbled murrelet, they're a bird of two worlds. They forage for fish in the sea, and then they fly up to 40 kilometers inland to feed a single chick. So they've got this really interesting life strategy. It takes a lot of energy to go out in the ocean and fish, but then they have their chick raised often very far inland that they're bringing food to. They are a species that is threatened or endangered through much of their range in Oregon, Washington, and California. Marbled murrelet is a pretty clumsy flyer. They describe them as a flying football. They're really good at flying fast, but once they get into a canopy, they're like they can't navigate very well, and they have webbed feet. So they actually hit the bole of a tree, and then they need to fall onto a nest branch that's at least 4 inches wide and covered in moss. And so they're not building a nest. They're using that branch to lay a single egg. So we're looking at a nest there. So what they require is old Douglas fir or mature Douglas fir that have very large branches that often grow up in a setting where a Douglas fir has lots of access to light and lots of growing space. So this study is reconstructing the disturbance history at 36 different marbled murrelet sites in the Central Oregon Coast Range. And what we want to learn is the history of fire in this region, and then also the development history of this habitat. So A lot of times we think about what habitat is. We can measure forest structure and composition and say, that's it, that's what this species needs. But what we're answering here is, well, how do you get it? How did it come to be? And how might we get more of it in the future? So at each one of these sites, the procedure is to put in what's called a forest inventory and analysis plot. This is basically 3 nested subplots where you stem map all the trees, measure their sizes, species, etc. And so we're installing these, and then we're coring all the trees in the plots to understand development history. We then go to the nearest possible place where we can create a fire record from stumps to learn about the histories of these nest stands. So just a visual here. The center plot here would have the nest tree in it, and then we'd be sampling the forest in the different subplots. So this is another figure with a lot on it, but it's showing you the structure and composition of one of these nest sites with the nest tree right in the middle represented by this triangle. I don't have the tree ages on here. I think that's a mistake on my part, but I do have the fires. This is a nest site that is very near the ocean. It's right by Yachats, Oregon, near the Yachats River. And it has some of the least frequent fire that we've seen in the Coast Range. So there's fires in 1535, 1556, over 200 years without a fire. Then there's the 1849 fire, which, if you know some of the history of the Coast Range, was one of these big, extensive east wind events. What we've learned here is that most of the structure that is at this stand was developed after that 1849 fire. So that's the pattern at one site. I want to compare it to the pattern at this Old Man Nest Creek site, which is near Mapleton, Oregon. So it's about 20 miles further inland in the Coast Range. And it has a very different record of fire at this site. So you're seeing the nest tree that in that photo there on the left. That tree is established in the 1540s. And this is the record of fire at this marbled murrelet habitat. This murrelet nest stand. So we picked up 6 different fires here in the 1800s and 4 different fires in the 1700s. Again, what we're seeing in the Coast Range is mirroring what we're seeing in the Western Cascades. There's a lot of variability in the tempo of fire historically in these Douglas fir forests. So compared to the other site where we saw 5 fires in 500 years, at this site, we saw 6 fires in 100 years. So very different in terms of their disturbance histories. And they both produced conditions today that support nesting habitat for a marbled murrelet pair. So next, I'm going to sort of take more of a landscape scale approach and wrap up tonight by taking you to the Elliott State Forest. We put together a fire history here on a grid. So what you're seeing here is a map of the Elliott State Forest, and then you're seeing 16 different sites where we put in fire records by sampling stumps. So what this enables us to do is to get individual point records of fire, but also look for larger or more extensive fires that would have burned broader areas in the Coast Range. So I'm going to walk through the results for this area at one site to start, and then all sites at the end. We're going to start at site LF12. If you can see my pointer, I'm circling that site now. Oh, sorry. Before I get there, I just wanted us to look at some photos from the early 1930s of the Elliott State Forest before I show you what the fire history was. So what I see in these photos is a mosaic of different fire effects. It looks like it's been a few decades since a fire happened, but you can definitely see evidence of fire in this photo, and it's not affecting or having the same severity across the whole landscape. And then you can really see it in this photo. So we've got bald areas that are open. We have recently burned stands with snags. We have older snags in patches on this landscape. A lot of people know that the Elliott State Forest was burned in 1868 by the Coos Bay fire. What you're seeing in this photo does not reflect just the Coos Bay fire. A lot of the fire effects I'm seeing in this photo from the 1930s are actually of much more recent fires. So next I'll show you some fire history for this area. So going to that site LF12, we have another one of our fire history graphs. Each tree gets its own timeline. Red triangles are fire. At this site, many trees recorded a fire in 1751. You can also see that this site also burned in the pretty famous 1868 Coos Bay fire. But as you look at that chart, you can see that this was an old forest that developed with quite a bit of fire, and it's in the Oregon Coast Range. So sort of bringing this up to the larger Elliott State Forest and the whole grid of sites, I'm going to show you the history for all the sites in that study at once. Right now, I have site LF12 on the graph by itself, and I've created a composite. So all the red triangles indicate the fire years at that site. And now I'm going to show you fires across all of them. So each site that we sampled has its own timeline. What I want you to notice here is that a lot of these triangles line up in time. So this one in particular, this is the year 1849. You can then move over here and you can see the year 1868. These are fires that burned across lots of different sites, and those sites are 10 kilometers apart. So these are extensive fires burning through the Coast Range. The other thing I want you to notice is that a lot of these triangles don't line up. So now I'm going to show you the bottom panel of this graph, and it's simply summing up the number of sites that recorded fire in the same year. So that at 1849, that's a huge fire year in the Coast Range. Lots of sites at big distances from each other record that fire. You can also see the 1868 fire, evidence of a big fire in 1776. And we have less information about the 1600s, but probably a relatively big fire in 1628. What's really interesting here is not just these big sort of east wind high severity events that burn broadly across the area. What's fascinating is the amount of smaller fires. So look at all these fires that only burned one or two sites. To me, that says that outside of sort of severe weather conditions, you can have fires on the west side that burn, and they do work in the forest, but they hit some sort of limitation to spread. And it's probably something like fuel moisture or topography that prevents it from becoming a big landscape or watershed scale fire. So our coastal forests appear to have a mixture of these small, relatively low severity fire events that are happening quite frequently. And then interspersed among that is these larger, probably weather driven, more extensive high severity events. Final poll for the presentation tonight. I think I went way too fast. I'm going to be happy to stick around for a while. Activate this last one after sharing results. So the answer for the Coast Range, how would you describe fire regimes? Right now, I'm going with all of the above. We have a lot to learn, but we're seeing quite a bit of variability there as well. And so final poll for tonight, an understanding poll. Our understanding of fire regimes and forest dynamics in West Side Douglas Fir Forest, whether you're in the Coast Range or the Cascades, is A. Wait, sorry, I got to close the other poll. There we go. A, our understanding is complete. This information matches our conventional theory and current policy, or it's emerging. We have a lot to learn going forward. There's pretty complex historical disturbance regimes, forest dynamics, and how people have influenced fire over time. So I happy to take more questions at this time and let you guys know that next week we'll be moving on to fire ecology and Eastside moist and subalpine forest led by James Johnston.
Andrew, thank you. This has been awesome. We will take some more questions here in just a second, but I think that maybe this is a good time for Jake to give us the keyword for SAF credits.
Yes, the keyword for tonight's session is Cascades.
Excellent. So Andrew, there's a couple of questions here. Do you think that in general, if you can find evidence of low severity fire, is that also evidence of indigenous fire management, of using fire in their indigenous practices?
It's an interesting question. I think not necessarily, because if you look at what contemporary fires in the west side are doing outside of severe east wind conditions, if you get like a 10,000 acre fire on the Willamette, most of it will be low and moderate severity. So you'll see quite a bit that's not stand replacing. So it would be really hard for us to decipher whether or not a low portion of a historical burn that we are reconstructing is cultural burning. It could be, but again, we'd have to use multiple lines of evidence to understand that.
Great. And here's a question from Melissa. Does downed wood in an advanced stage of decay and presumably wet affect the severity of fire, and does it have the capability to influence return interval?
Good question. I'm not great at understanding fuel moisture and sort of how it affects fire spread. I think people on the ground are much better at that. One thing that I'm sort of thinking of as a hypothesis is that when these forests on the west side are mature or old, they have a lot of 1,000-hour fuels that hold a lot of water, and they take a long time to dry out. And I've been looking at or looking for fire climate relationships with our fire records on the west side. And they're actually really hard to find, which has been surprising. The basic theory in fire ecology is that if you're in a wet, productive place, your fires are only going to happen in droughts. And I'm not finding that signal. And so I'm wondering if what it really takes to put a big fire on the landscape on the west side is a weather event. You have to have these severe weather conditions that aren't necessarily climate, which is long scale, to enable some of these bigger burns. And then we're seeing so many other fires that sort of suggest fire outside of that's probably smaller and limited by when it meets these conditions that hold a lot of moisture. So I think that sort of explains why we see a lot more frequent fire after a big stand replacing fire, is those heavy moisture retaining structures are moved out of the equation.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that from my fire dabbling kind of viewpoint in there is that folks who engage in fire behavior analysis will tell you that fires are fires are primarily carried by the relatively fine surface fuels. And so the conditions that create that would be, these big post-fire events where we've got shrubbery cover, where we've got grass, where we've got needle fall, where we've got fine branches accumulating, something like that. But of course, it has a tempo because there's only a certain period of time when that's the case, and then it starts to get shaded out and it becomes something different. And those larger fuels, as Andrew is referencing, while those have the potential to dry out and burn for a long time and result in higher impact on the soil, so higher soil severity, some of it because they burn for a long time, they're not necessarily what's instigating or enabling the big fires. So the big fires are likely to come from these less frequent weather events where you get the summer dry period followed by the hot, dry, windy day plus ignition. And then that's what's going to allow you to have the surface fire that transitioned into an active crown fire and can carry through the crown over larger scales. And so I think that all of those pieces are coming together. And so it's not so much that the big fuels there are the thing that's really carrying the fire across the landscape. The big fuel is the thing that's increasing severity in that mosaic in places where it actually exists. So that would be my theory there. Heather asks, are fires becoming more severe with climate change in West Side forests?
That's a great question and a difficult one to answer, because we do see examples of very extensive severe fires on the west side in the 1800s. And so we see them today. And it could be that the conditions that align to enable them are more common, but we're talking about events that happen once a century or so. So it's really hard to, prove that there's a trend there. There is a paper by John Abatsoglu that argues that the conditions that enabled the 2020 fires were more likely because of climate change. But to me, what's interesting about Westside forests is that they are characterized by both those big extensive events and the frequent ones that are lower severity. They have this really broad amplitude of things that they've been adapted to over time. So I kind of think that as a hopeful thing for Westside Forest, because they're able to withstand a much broader range of things than our dry forests east of the Cascades.
So the remaining questions in here kind of are things that are going to, I think, extend us out a little bit beyond the core focus of yours. So if this is outside your bailiwick and would rather have us find some other resources for these folks, just let us know. But
Sure.
Meredith asks if you could talk about if and how adaptability of Douglas fir to fire and other Westside tree species might be changing as a result of climate change.
Definitely not in my wheelhouse. Good question. I would say it's got this sort of ability to withstand more fire, and that as fire increases, it'll express that more, but not something I've looked at or had expertise in.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that as geneticists and others have done more and more research on tree species and start to think about adaptability in the face of climate change, that one of the things that I've heard over and over is that our tree species typically have more plasticity, more ability to kind of shift and adapt than what we would think that they would. And it's not necessarily that, like a low elevation, warm adapted tree is going to be the best thing for a warmer future, because there may actually be more plasticity in tree species coming from other areas that you wouldn't even anticipate it. So there's hidden genetic plasticity that may allow these species to exist in places where we wouldn't think they would be able to. So beauty of nature. Can you touch on pyrogenic carbon and studies that may be associated with cultural burning and production of pyrogenic carbon?
I can't touch on it specifically, but I can refer you to two different students at OSU who are looking at that question, along with soil scientists at OSU. One ongoing study on the Mac Dunn is we're pairing with them to give them a fire history, and then they're looking at the effects of pyrogenic carbon in the soil. So
Yeah.
I can follow up on that one.
Yeah, so just if you'll shoot that information to me, we'll post the link to any stuff that's here. So that's
Okay.
great. And let's see. I think you answered this before, but this is maybe worth a repeat. Is there indication that when there are frequent fires in the Cascades and Coast Ranges, that was because of indigenous persons burning?
We have a lot to learn and to understand that, but one thing that sticks out about the Elliott and parts of the Siuslaw National Forest where we're finding lots of fire is that there's not a lot of lightning there. It maybe wasn't so surprising to find a ton of fire in the Umpqua National Forest because it's loaded with lightning, but it's hard to see how fire was that frequent in the Coast Range without it being supplied by cultural burning. And that's another thing that's ongoing research. Glenn Jones is reconstructing and studying cultural burning in the Coast Range, sort of in the LC Lobster Valley area now. So hopefully in the next few years we can answer that question a little bit better.
Excellent. Here's an interesting one. Beavers were more common in the forests here until the fur trappers came through, and they of course created water meadows and wetlands that kept forests wetter. Would an increase in fires in the 1800s and 1900s possibly be related to drops in beaver populations?
I'm actually going to go the other way on this one. It's kind of cheating, but my wife is a beaver ecologist, and she's been studying them for years. And one thing she's always finding is that one of the major limiting factors to beavers is food. They require a lot of it, and they can eat themselves out of house and home pretty quickly, and then they have to move. And they thrive on early seral hardwood vegetation, and fires in the Coast Range and in the Cascades produce that. And so if you remember that photo, those air photos of the Elliott, there was a lot of hardwoods in that photo that aren't there today. And we've heard, similar documentation on the Mount Hood and other places that this used to be a meadow. It used to be broadleaves, willow, et cetera. And now it's a conifer forest. And that sort of food base just doesn't support beaver.
That's excellent. Thank you. This gets more into like, what do we do now? So given the variability of fire on the west side of the Cascades, are there forest management practices that you would anticipate to be advantageous for preventing high severity fires in and around highly populated areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to be careful here. When we learned about fire ecology on the east side, people spent decades learning about how to do fuel treatments, and then they finally got encountered by fires, and then they got a chance to learn. So we're a ways out from that, but I think there's some things that are worth looking at. The mature forest structure that moderates that fire climate environment and keeps those fine fuels out may be a strategy that would work. The trouble there is on the west side, there can be those east wind events where no matter what you have there, it could burn. But say you're outside of severe weather conditions, that mature forest structure where you've limited the understory fuels and you have a mesic microclimate might be good under non-east wind fires. So that's something we should look at and we should research. The other thing where I think this applies is we have a lot of plantations on the west side. They were designed to be harvested. Our sort of conventional model for succession for Douglas fir says, if you have a bunch of Douglas fir and they're even aged, they'll grow into old growth forest all on their own. But we're finding that that's not really how it happened in most of the cases, and that fire and intermediate, like low moderate disturbances actually shaped that into old growth. So I think that's another place this research guides what we do in terms of fire management and restoring forest habitats is those plantations don't fit what we're seeing in the historical record.
What do you think the role of red alder is in the recovery of forests after fire?
Yeah, good question. Red alder is a nitrogen fixing species. In these moist forests after a fire, it that loves that. It can fill in. So it's probably increasing the productivity of those sites. There's also people interested in understanding how hardwoods like red alder, they're not very flammable. They have, green leaves through the fire season, and they don't have these continuous canopies. Might have been important to sort of breaking up these fires on the west side historically. So as we lose them and move out from that to sort of a continuous Douglas fir canopy, we might be losing some fire resilience. So they're increasing productivity after a wildfire, and keeping them in the system might help us sort of mitigate the extent and size of some fires on the west side.
So Pam asks, what role does invasive vegetation play in more recent fires?
Oh, I'd love to be able to answer that, but I haven't tracked it on the west side. There's certainly invasive grasses that could be playing a role, but I'm sorry, I'm going to punt there.
And we have gorse and Scotch broom also really commonly invading our sites. And I've been curious too, is what's the implication for those species? Because they can be quite flammable and create their own kind of ground fire. So that would be a really good thing for more study. I haven't seen that information either. And I think this is like a toss-up for any of the foresters on the line here. When self-thinning occurs, do those surviving trees have the advantage of better resources, better genetics, or both? So like maybe the question there is, what sets up those trees that survive self-thinning to be the ones that survive?
It's a good question. Part of it could be luck of ice storms, other insects and pathogens, but in general, I think if you have more growing space than your neighbor and you're in the upper canopy as a Douglas fir, you've got a better shot. I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but I'm not a big fan of the self-thinning and stand development concept. And my reasoning there is we do have a couple stands we've gone to that established in the year 1700 and they haven't had a disturbance. And they're all the Douglas fir that were there 200 years ago are still there. They're just growing incredibly slow. And so that self-thinning process, when it happens, is just sort of a tree versus tree dynamic is actually extremely slow. And they just get really skinny crowns and they just eke out a living. And that's why I think a lot of what actually thinned stands were disturbances, wind, fire, insects, and disease, rather than just slowly losing the race.
I think that's a great answer and a good stopping point. We have answered all of tonight's questions. Andrew, thank you. Excellent information, mind bending in a lot of ways and mind expanding. So we just appreciate you taking your valuable time and sharing with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining me. Appreciate it.